Story 34. A loud banging sound coming from outside, but there's nothing there when you check. It was a quiet Saturday evening, and Ella was curled up on the couch, enjoying the peace of her small countryside home. The night was calm, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of crickets filling the air. The kind of stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath. As she sipped her tea and flicked through a book, a sudden, sharp bang echoed through the house. Ella froze. It wasn't the usual creaking of old wood or the occasional thud of a tree branch against the window. This was something different, louder, more deliberate. It sounded like it came from the direction of her back door, the one that led out into the dark backyard, where the tree line began. She set her cup down on the table, her pulse quickening. Was it an animal? A branch falling? She couldn't be sure, but the sound had been so clear and so unnerving. Ella grabbed her phone, just in case, and cautiously approached the back door. As she reached for the handle, she hesitated, the stillness of the night pressing down on her. She took a deep breath and opened the door slowly. The backyard was empty. The grass swayed gently in the wind, and the trees whispered softly, but there was no sign of anything that could have made that loud bang. No fallen branches, no creatures rummaging around, nothing. She stepped outside, her breath forming tiny clouds in the cool air. She walked around the back of the house, checking the perimeter, her senses heightened, but everything looked perfectly normal. Just the quiet, dark expanse of her yard, stretching out toward the woods. Confused and uneasy, Ella turned to head back inside when the sound came again. Bang. This time, it was louder, more intense, as though it was coming from somewhere near the side of the house. Ella whipped around, her heart racing. The darkness of the backyard was oppressive, and she couldn't see a thing beyond the faint outline of the trees. She checked the windows for any sign of movement but saw nothing. A shiver ran down her spine. She stepped back inside and locked the door behind her, then quickly turned on the porch light. The bright beam illuminated the backyard, revealing nothing but shadows and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Ella shook her head, trying to calm herself. It had to be an animal, right? A raccoon or something knocking against the house. Maybe a stray branch falling in the wind? But something about the noise felt wrong. Too deliberate, too insistent. She returned to the couch, her mind racing, but the banging didn't stop. Bang, bang. The noise seemed to move now, as if it were shifting from one spot to another. The rhythm of it was steady, almost like a knock on the door, but louder, more forceful. Ella couldn't ignore it anymore. The fear gnawed at her stomach. She grabbed a flashlight and hurried back to the back door, this time stepping outside with more caution. She pointed the beam of light into the yard, scanning the dark corners, the trees, the porch, but still, nothing. Her breath caught when she heard it again, this time coming from directly behind her. Bang! She spun around, the beam of the flashlight darting wildly, but there was no one there. The cold air prickled her skin as she stood there, rooted to the spot. The woods felt like they were closing in around her, and the silence that followed the last bang was suffocating. Was someone playing a prank? Could someone be hiding in the woods, trying to frighten her? The thought made her skin crawl. She backed up to the door, fumbling with the handle to get inside. Just as her hand reached the door, she heard it again. The final bang, louder and more desperate than before. It was right behind her, so close that the vibration of it seemed to shake the air around her. Ella whirled around, heart racing, the flashlight blinding her as it swept across the yard. There was nothing there. No one. Panicked, she slammed the door shut and bolted it. She stood with her back pressed against the door, breathing heavily, her mind spinning. The banging had stopped, but the feeling of something, or someone, watching her lingered in the air. She stood there, in the silence, the darkness outside pressing in like a weight, unsure of what to do. It was then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the window next to the door, fog had begun to form, as if someone had been standing outside, breathing heavily against it. The condensation had gathered into a shape, a handprint, but there had been no one, and the handprint was still there, slowly fading away. Story 35. The sense that something is crawling through your walls. Tessa had always loved her little apartment on the edge of town. It was quiet and peaceful, with an old-world charm that she couldn't resist. The creaky wooden floors, the vintage wallpaper, and the ivy creeping up the outside walls gave it a cozy, almost nostalgic feel. It was the perfect place to settle into after a busy day at work. But recently, something had changed. At first, it was subtle. A light scratching sound in the middle of the night, faint enough that she convinced herself it was just the house settling. Then, it became more frequent, like tiny, skittering paws, moving just beneath the surface of the walls. The noise started at random times. Early in the morning, late at night, sometimes in the middle of the afternoon. It was always the same. A soft, persistent scratching, followed by the unmistakable sound of something small and frantic moving through the walls. Tessa tried to ignore it. She told herself it was just mice or squirrels, perhaps nesting somewhere in the old structure. But the more she listened, the more unnerving the sounds became. It wasn't just scratching anymore. Now, it felt like something was crawling, dragging itself slowly along the walls, as if it were searching for something or someone. One evening, she sat in her living room, reading a book, when the crawling began again. This time, it sounded heavier, more deliberate and closer. It was coming from the wall right behind her, near the corner where the room met the hallway. Her heart started racing as the sound grew louder, like something was scraping against the drywall from the other side. She stood up, her pulse quickening. The air felt cold and still, as if the entire apartment was holding its breath. She pressed her ear to the wall, hoping for some sign that it was just a pipe or the building settling. But the crawling didn't stop. Instead, it grew more frantic, faster and louder, as if something was struggling to move. Her breath caught in her throat. She could almost feel it on the other side of the wall, its presence unmistakable. Tessa backed away, her eyes darting around the room. She needed to find out what it was. She grabbed a flashlight and a hammer, her mind racing as she approached the wall, where the sound had seemed to be coming from. Taking a deep breath, she started tapping the wall lightly with the hammer, testing the strength of the drywall. The noise inside grew louder, more insistent, like it was reacting to her movements. It almost felt like it was aware of her, following her hand as it moved across the surface. With a sudden jolt of fear, she swung the hammer down harder, creating a small crack in the wall. The crawling sound inside stopped abruptly. Tessa froze, holding her breath. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the eerie silence of the room. But then, in the stillness, a low, guttural noise filled the air. It wasn't a voice, but a strange, unnatural sound that seemed to reverberate from deep within the wall. Her fingers trembled as she tapped the crack again, making it wider. The sound from inside grew more frantic, as though something was trying to push its way out. She hesitated, terror washing over her as she leaned in closer to the hole. And then there it was. A dark, wet shape slowly emerged from the crack, like a twisted hand reaching out from within the wall. It was covered in a slick, oily substance, and its fingers, long and pale, twisted unnaturally as it crawled free. Tessa recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. The thing, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything she had ever seen before. It looked like something that shouldn't exist, like something that had been trapped in the walls for far too long. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away as possible, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The hand stretched further, followed by another and another, until a dark, twisted face emerged from the hole. Eyes wide and hollow, mouth opening in a silent scream. Before she could scream, the thing lunged at her. She barely managed to backpedal, slamming her body against the wall as she frantically fumbled for the door. With a burst of adrenaline, she threw open the door and ran out into the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the sound of crawling continued, following her, getting closer, relentless. Tessa ran down the stairs, out into the night air, not stopping until she was at the far edge of the property. She turned back to look at the apartment, her body shaking uncontrollably. From the window, a single pale hand appeared, reaching out toward her from the walls. It was still there, and it was waiting for her to come back. Story 36. A doorbell ring followed by a strange, muffled voice calling your name. Sophie had just settled in for the evening. The lights were dim, her favorite movie was playing on the screen, and a bowl of popcorn sat untouched on the coffee table. It was the kind of quiet night she'd been craving all week. She was alone, with only the sound of the movie to keep her company, when suddenly, ding-dong, the doorbell rang, sharp and clear, breaking the silence. Sophie froze. Who could be at the door at this hour? It was well past 10, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She grabbed her phone from the table, checking for any missed messages or calls. Nothing. The doorbell rang again, this time more insistent, followed by the faint sound of a voice. A voice that, at first, she couldn't quite make out. Sophie. Sophie. The voice was soft, almost muffled, as if coming from a distance. It sent a chill crawling up her spine. She stood still, her hand gripping her phone tightly, her mind racing. Was someone playing a prank on her? Her first instinct was to check the peephole, but fear held her in place. She glanced nervously around the living room, half expecting someone to appear in the window or on the porch. The voice came again, clearer this time. Sophie, let me in. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The voice sounded familiar, but it couldn't be. It was like a whisper that echoed in her ears, yet no one was there. Her breath quickened. Who was at the door? And how did they know her name? Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She crept quietly to the door, peeking through the peephole. The porch was empty. No one stood there. The streetlight outside illuminated the porch, casting long shadows, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just an empty night. The voice, however, didn't stop. Sophie, please, I need your help. Her pulse quickened, her body frozen with dread. It sounded like someone calling from just beyond the door. But who? The tone was desperate, pleading, but also unsettling, as though something was terribly off. She hesitated for a long moment, torn between fear and curiosity. Part of her wanted to open the door, to confront whatever was waiting on the other side. But the other part of her screamed not to. Ding-dong. The doorbell rang again, and this time, the voice followed almost immediately. Sophie, let me in. I can't stay out here. Her mind raced. There was no way this was real. Was it a recording? A prank? But how? The voice sounded too real, too human, and the way it called her name, like it knew her, like it was trying to reach her, felt personal. Sophie backed away from the door, her heart pounding. The voice continued, growing louder, more desperate. Sophie, it's me. Please, open the door. The air felt colder, and a wave of nausea swept over her. She couldn't do it. She couldn't open the door. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't right. With shaking hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed the police. Her mind too clouded with fear to make any coherent explanation. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. The voice at the door grew louder, now frantic, begging. Sophie, please. It's cold out here. I need you. I need to come inside. Her body was trembling now, her skin prickling with fear. Then, in a moment of sheer panic, she looked out the window. There, standing just outside the yard, in the pale moonlight, was someone, or something. The figure was tall, unnaturally still, its silhouette almost indistinguishable from the shadows around it. And though Sophie could not make out any details, she could feel its eyes on her, watching her, as the voice continued to call her name from behind the door. Sophie, it's me. But it wasn't anyone she knew. It couldn't be. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she backed away from the window, desperately trying to process what was happening. The voice was still there, and now she could hear something else, scratching at the door, as though something was trying to get in, or worse, trying to crawl its way through. With a burst of adrenaline, Sophie grabbed her keys and fled out the back door, not looking back as she ran into the darkness, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't stop until she was a few blocks away, standing in the middle of a street, panting for air. She glanced back at her apartment. The doorbell rang again, but this time, she heard nothing. Not a voice, not a sound. Only the oppressive silence of the empty house, waiting, and she knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that the figure in her yard, the one that had called her name, was still out there, still waiting, still watching. The worst part? Sophie wasn't sure if she had truly escaped, or if the voice had followed her, waiting for the moment she returned. Story 37. The overwhelming feeling of being trapped, even though you're alone in your own house. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. Megan had been looking forward to spending the night alone in her house, a rare opportunity after weeks of running around with work and social obligations. She curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house her only company. The warmth of the house seemed to wrap around her like a comforting blanket, but something felt off. At first, Megan dismissed the sensation. It was just the tiredness catching up to her. She glanced around the living room. The cozy furnishings, the faint glow of the dim lamp. Everything looked perfectly normal. Yet, that uneasy feeling gnawed at the edges of her thoughts, like she was being watched, or like something in the house was out of place. She stood up, pacing around the room, hoping to shake off the feeling. She checked the windows, the locks on the doors, even peeked into the kitchen to make sure nothing had been disturbed. But everything was fine. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the rooms or the walls. It was her. The feeling of being trapped, of being surrounded by walls that were closing in on her, settled in deeper. She went to the window and looked outside. The world was calm and still, bathed in the gentle light of the street lamps. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, and the empty street stretched out into the quiet night. There was nothing threatening out there, nothing to be afraid of. But when she turned back around to face the living room, the weight in her chest grew heavier. The walls seemed to shrink. The ceiling felt lower. The house, which had always been a place of comfort, now felt like a cage. Megan shook her head, trying to dismiss the rising panic. She was alone, in her own home. There was no reason to feel this way. But no matter where she went, whether it was the kitchen, the hallway, or her bedroom, nothing felt right. It was like the walls were watching her, pressing in from every side. Her breath grew shallow, and she stopped, standing in the middle of the hallway. The house had never felt so suffocating. Megan hurried to the door, needing fresh air, but her hand hesitated on the knob. Something in her mind told her she couldn't leave. Not yet. The door, which had always been her escape, now felt like another barrier, another place she couldn't pass through. A quiet, muffled sound interrupted her thoughts, the sound of something scraping against the floor upstairs. The house was old, and sometimes it creaked, but this sounded different. It was slow, deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving around upstairs. Megan froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been certain no one else was in the house. She had checked every room, locked every door. But the sound continued, dragging across the floorboards, coming closer. With a shaking hand, she turned the doorknob and stepped into the hallway. The air felt thick, suffocating. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. Everything seemed to pulse with a strange, oppressive energy. The sound from upstairs grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Footsteps, slow, measured footsteps, like someone walking toward her, step by step, deliberately. Megan's legs felt weak beneath her, and her stomach twisted in fear. She backed away from the stairs, but it was as if the house itself was closing in on her. She couldn't move toward the door. She couldn't leave. The walls seemed to shift, bending in on themselves, pulling her deeper into the house. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a voice. It was a whisper, so faint that she could barely hear it. Megan. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her name, but the voice didn't sound like anyone she knew. It wasn't familiar. It was hollow, distorted, like it came from deep within the walls themselves. Megan's breath caught in her throat, her legs shaking as she turned toward the stairs. She knew she had to leave. The air in the house was thick now, the walls pressing in on her from all sides. She tried to move, to run, but it felt like the house was holding her back, keeping her trapped. The voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. Megan, you can't leave. A cold wave of dread washed over her, and she realized with a sickening certainty that she wasn't just trapped in the house physically. The house had become part of her, and she was part of it. It was a cage, and it was keeping her there. Panic surged through her. She ran to the front door again, desperate to escape. But as she reached for the knob, the voice boomed, loud and clear. "Megan, you belong here." The door slammed shut in her face, and she stumbled back, gasping for air. The walls seemed to close in around her even tighter, like they were alive, suffocating her. The house was no longer just a home. It was a prison, and she was its prisoner. And as she looked around the now darkened hallway, she realized, with a growing sense of horror, that there was nowhere left to go. The house had trapped her, and now it would never let her leave. Story 38. An unexplained chill sweeping through the house on a warm night. It was a warm, late summer evening, the kind of night that made the air thick with heat, where the scent of grass and earth hung heavy, and the gentle hum of crickets outside felt like a lullaby. Emily had just finished dinner, and the house was quiet, save for the soft click of the ceiling fan in the living room. She felt comfortable, relaxed, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere as she leaned back on the couch with a book in hand. But then, without warning, a sudden chill swept through the room. It was so abrupt, it made her skin prickle, and she shivered involuntarily. Emily looked up from her book, her eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. The windows were closed, the fan was on its usual setting, and the air conditioning wasn't running. There was no reason for a sudden drop in temperature, yet the room felt frigid, like a gust of cold wind had rushed through the walls. She shrugged it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination. The house was old, after all. Old houses had drafts. Maybe there was a small gap in a window she hadn't noticed. But as she went back to reading, the chill lingered. It seemed to settle around her, a cold, invisible presence that she couldn't shake. After a few minutes, Emily put down her book and stood up, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders. She moved toward the window, but when she touched the pane, it was warm to the touch. No draft, no reason for the cold. She looked at the clock on the wall, 9:30 p.m. Still far too early for it to be this cold. A sudden thought crossed her mind. What if it was a power outage? She'd heard about strange things happening during a blackout. Sudden drops in temperature, odd sensations in the air. But the lights were on. The house was fully powered. She moved cautiously through the house, trying to ignore the uncomfortable sensation that seemed to follow her. The chill didn't seem to have a specific source. It was everywhere. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen. It followed her as she went. Each room felt colder than the last, the temperature dropping steadily. As she entered the kitchen, she noticed something strange. The small hanging light above the counter flickered briefly before returning to its normal glow. "Okay, now that's odd," Emily muttered to herself. There was no reason for the light to flicker. There had been no storms or power fluctuations in the area. She reached up to touch the light bulb, and as her fingers brushed against it, she felt an unmistakable coldness radiating from it. The bulb, usually warm from use, was chilling to the touch. Her heart began to race. Emily turned quickly, heading for the thermostat on the wall. Maybe the air conditioning had malfunctioned and was blasting cold air through the house. But the temperature readout on the digital display said the house was still comfortably warm, and yet the cold persisted. Suddenly, she heard it, soft, almost inaudible, like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the house. It wasn't clear, but it sounded like a breath, a deep, cold exhale in the otherwise silent home. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned around, scanning the dark hallway beyond the kitchen. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, like they were moving toward her. The cold was intensifying, wrapping itself around her like an invisible blanket, suffocating her, filling the air with a sense of unease. With trembling hands, she turned the corner and walked toward the hallway. The chill grew stronger, and the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. "Emily." Her name, spoken softly, with a strange, hollow quality that made her blood run cold. She froze in her tracks. The voice wasn't coming from the walls or the rooms. It was coming from within her own house, as if it were echoing inside the very structure of the building. "Who's there?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like she was shouting into the suffocating darkness. She didn't want to sound afraid, but the chill in the air had become overwhelming. She could see her breath fogging in front of her. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the coldness vanished. The house seemed to exhale, and the temperature began to return to normal. Emily stood in the hallway, her body shaking. The warmth from the night crept back in, but it didn't feel the same. There was a lingering sensation in the air, like something had been there with her, something she couldn't explain. The temperature was fine, but the feeling, the oppressive weight of the cold, remained. She turned to head back toward the living room, but as she did, the light flickered again. And just before it went out completely, she heard it once more. "Emily." She froze. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a low, guttural sound, like something had exhaled her name from the depths of the house itself. It was close, too real. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run, but she didn't move. She couldn't move. Something was watching her, something was waiting, and now she understood. The cold wasn't just the temperature, it was a presence. The lights went out, and the whisper grew louder. Now a chorus of voices calling her name from every direction. "Emily." The darkness swallowed her whole, leaving her to face the overwhelming cold that would never leave her, never let her go. Story 39. An old, forgotten toy starting to play by itself in the middle of the night. It had been years since Emma's parents had moved the old wooden chest out of the attic, the one that had been tucked away under layers of dust and cobwebs. The chest was filled with things from her childhood, old books, clothing, and toys she hadn't thought about in ages. Among the forgotten treasures, there was one toy that always stood out to her. A small, stuffed bear, worn with age. She remembered it fondly, though she couldn't recall when she had last seen it. One night, after unpacking a few of the old items, Emma decided to place the bear on the shelf in her bedroom, alongside her other childhood mementos. It felt comforting to have something familiar in the room, even if it had been tucked away for so long. That night, she went to bed as usual, the house settling into its quiet rhythm. The walls creaked softly, and the faint hum of the refrigerator echoed through the stillness of the night. Emma fell into a deep sleep, unaware of the strange events that would unfold. In the middle of the night, Emma was woken by a soft sound, a faint, high-pitched tune. It took her a few moments to recognize it. It was coming from the direction of her shelf. A familiar lullaby, the one her mother used to play for her when she was little. But the toy bear was the only thing on the shelf, and it hadn't been touched. Emma frowned in confusion. The lullaby continued, faint but clear, its melody softly drifting through the room. Her first thought was that it must be the wind, or perhaps a noise from another part of the house, but it was so precise, so intentional. She sat up in bed, her heart beginning to pound. The sound wasn't coming from anywhere else, just the bear. With a deep breath, Emma turned on her bedside lamp and got out of bed. She approached the shelf, the music growing louder with each step. The stuffed bear was sitting perfectly still in the exact spot she had left it earlier, its button eyes gleaming in the lamplight. The lullaby played on. She reached for the bear, her fingers trembling. She was sure the music wasn't coming from any mechanical part of the toy. There was no visible speaker or mechanism. It was as if the bear itself was producing the sound. But that was impossible, wasn't it? As she lifted the bear, the music stopped abruptly, leaving only the silence of the room behind. Emma stood frozen, staring down at the toy in her hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then, with a soft click, the toy's eyes seemed to gleam brighter, almost as if it were looking at her. The lullaby started again, this time louder, more insistent. Emma dropped the bear, her breath catching in her throat. The music stopped again, but the air in the room felt thick, charged with an unseen presence. She backed away slowly, unable to tear her eyes away from the toy. It remained where she had dropped it, on the floor now, its fur rumpled and the melody still faintly echoing in her mind. There was something about the way the bear looked at her, something unsettling in its expression. Suddenly, the room felt colder, and the shadowy corners seemed to stretch unnaturally. Emma quickly ran out of the room, shutting the door behind her. The sound of the lullaby seemed to follow her, fading in and out as though it were trailing behind her through the house. Her heart raced, and every instinct told her to leave, but she stood frozen, unsure of what was happening, unsure if it was just her imagination. The lullaby stopped. Emma didn't dare go back into her bedroom that night, not even to check on the bear. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The toy, once a simple memento from her childhood, now felt like an entity, alive, aware, and waiting. The next morning, she gathered the courage to return to her room. She cautiously opened the door, half expecting the toy to be gone, or to be in a different place altogether. But the bear was exactly where she had left it, on the floor, its eyes gleaming in the morning light. As Emma approached the toy, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She picked it up gingerly, inspecting it for any signs of a mechanical component that could have played the lullaby. But there was nothing. No battery compartment, no wires, nothing that could explain what had happened. Then, as she held the bear, she felt it, a tiny vibration, like something was moving inside. The toy's eyes seemed to shift. They no longer appeared like lifeless buttons, but something much more alive, much more knowing. The lullaby began to play again, but this time it was different. The melody was darker, slower, filled with a haunting quality that Emma had never heard before. The toy was no longer just a forgotten relic of her childhood. It was something else entirely, something that had awoken from its slumber, and it wasn't ready to be forgotten again. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and distant. And in the quiet of the morning, as Emma stood holding the toy, she realized that she had invited something far more sinister into her home, something that wasn't going to let her forget. Story 40. A faint scratching sound from behind the walls or under the floorboards. It was the kind of old house that creaked and groaned, the kind where every step on the floorboards made a sound, the kind of house that, over time, you'd come to ignore the noises, the wind, the pipes, the house settling. It all just blended into the background. But there was one noise, one sound that Emily couldn't ignore. It started subtly at first, just a faint scratching, like something small, clawing at the wood. It was late in the evening, long after the sun had gone down. The house was quiet except for the occasional rustle of the trees outside in the wind. Emily had just settled down in her bedroom, the light from her lamp casting long shadows against the walls, when she heard it again. The scratching. It came from beneath the floorboards. At first, she convinced herself it was just a rodent, maybe a mouse scurrying around. That was easy to believe, especially in an old house like this one. But as the scratching continued, it started to feel too deliberate, too rhythmic, as though whatever was there was not just searching for food, but trying to get somewhere. She stood up from her bed and approached the floor near the sound. It was coming from directly beneath her feet, and it was so distinct, so sharp. It made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't just the random scurrying of a rodent. It was something else, something that seemed aware of her presence. The scratching continued, but it had changed. It was no longer soft, but loud and persistent, as though whatever was underneath the floor was growing more desperate. The sound echoed through the wooden planks, and the house seemed to hum with it. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She knelt down, placing her ear to the floorboards, trying to make out what it could be. There was a pause, a strange silence that filled the room, making her feel as if she had been holding her breath for too long. Then, it started again, but this time, it was accompanied by a low, muffled thudding. Emily recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. The scratching turned into scraping, as if something was trying to claw its way through the wood. Panic gripped her chest. She backed away from the floor, heart racing, the sound continuing to reverberate beneath her. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped, or maybe the house was just settling in a strange way. But the fear in her gut told her otherwise. This wasn't normal. She grabbed her phone and dialed her neighbor, hoping for some rational explanation, but there was no answer. The silence in the house seemed to grow heavier, like something was watching her, waiting. Then the scratching stopped abruptly. She stood there, holding her phone, staring at the floor in disbelief. The quiet was almost more terrifying than the sound itself. Had it stopped? Was it over? Just as she thought the worst was behind her, the sound came again. But this time, it wasn't from beneath the floor. It was from the walls. The walls on the opposite side of the room. Her heart skipped a beat. The scratching was more frantic now, as if something was trapped in the walls, moving rapidly, desperately trying to get out. It was louder and closer than ever before. The noise was so intense, it felt like the entire house was vibrating with it. Emily's hands shook as she rushed to the door and flung it open. She was about to run out of the room when she froze. In the dim light, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A faint outline. No, a shadow, pressing against the wall. It was moving, shifting in a way that defied logic, like something trying to push its way through the plaster. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her mouth. The scratching grew louder, more erratic. The shadow began to stretch, warping unnaturally, as if it were trying to crawl toward her. Before she could react, the shadow suddenly retracted, disappearing back into the wall. Just as the scratching stopped, everything went eerily still. Emily stumbled backward, her legs weak, and she slammed the door shut behind her. She couldn't understand what had just happened. Was it some kind of trick of the light? A figment of her imagination? But the silence in the room wasn't normal. It was pregnant with something unsettling. Something was there, waiting, watching. The scratching began again, but this time, it wasn't just beneath the floor or in the walls. It was coming from all directions, as though it was inside the very bones of the house itself. Emily ran from her bedroom, her heart racing, her mind spinning with the horrors she had just witnessed. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, the sound of the scratching followed her, relentless, growing louder with each step. It was as if the house had come alive, and it wasn't letting her go. Story 41. Hearing your front door slowly creaking open when you're sure you locked it. It was a quiet evening when Laura returned home from her long day at work. The sky had already darkened, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk as she parked her car. The familiar comfort of her house greeted her as she walked through the front door, the warmth from the heater enveloping her after the chilly winter air. She hung up her coat, kicked off her shoes, and sighed in relief. It had been a stressful day, and all she wanted was to relax. She moved toward the living room, preparing to settle in for the night when she paused. Something felt off. At first, she couldn't put her finger on it. The house was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of the refrigerator was absent, and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then she heard it, a faint sound that broke the silence. The creak of her front door. Her heart skipped a beat. Laura's eyes immediately darted to the hallway, where the door was located. She had locked it before leaving that morning. She was absolutely certain of it. The creaking sound continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pushing the door open, inch by inch. Laura's breath caught in her throat. No one was supposed to be in the house. She hadn't received any calls or texts. No one was expected. Her mind raced. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the lock had somehow failed. But as she approached the hallway, the creaking grew louder, more distinct and unmistakable. She reached the front door, her hand trembling as she extended it toward the doorknob. The door was still locked, just as she had left it. At least, the lock was still secure. Yet, the door itself continued to groan under an unseen pressure, creaking with a force that shouldn't have been there. She stepped back, her pulse quickening. How could this be happening? For a moment, the sound stopped. Complete silence returned, and for a fleeting second, Laura wondered if she had imagined the whole thing. But as she exhaled, trying to calm her racing thoughts, the sound began again. This time more pronounced, the hinges protesting loudly as the door creaked open by itself, just a crack. Her stomach twisted into knots. Laura slowly backed away, her breath shallow, her mind spinning with every possible explanation. But nothing made sense. The wind wouldn't have been able to push the door open like that. Not in this weather, and definitely not without the lock moving first. Who could be in the house? The thought paralyzed her, her eyes glued to the door as it inched wider with every passing second. Then, she heard something even more chilling. A footstep, A slow, deliberate step from behind the door, as though someone was entering her home and carefully pushing it open, inch by inch, with the intent to remain unnoticed. Laura's heart hammered in her chest, and she backed away further, into the shadows of the living room. Her mind was frantic, trying to come up with an explanation, but none could justify what she was hearing. She could no longer see the door, but she could hear it, creaking and groaning as though it were being opened by invisible hands. The footsteps were no longer just a single step. They were now a series, one after another, moving closer toward her. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. But before she could even press the call button, the creaking stopped. Complete silence. She stared at the front door, terrified of what would happen next. Would someone step through it? Was someone already inside? Her mind raced, spinning with questions and possibilities. But before she could move, she heard the voice. Laura. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Her name, spoken from the shadows behind the door, a voice that wasn't hers. It was a voice that shouldn't have been there. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Someone had called her name. Someone who knew she was alone. She didn't think. She ran. With her heart pounding in her chest, she bolted for the back door. She didn't look back, didn't care about anything else except getting out. But as she reached for the back door handle, she heard something that froze her in place. The front door slammed shut. A loud, deafening sound that echoed through the house, followed by complete and utter silence. Laura stood still in the doorway, her hand gripping the cold handle of the back door. What was happening? Had it been a prank? A dream? But when she finally worked up the courage to look back toward the front of the house, her heart stopped. The door was locked again, but now it was wide open. Story 42. The unsettling sensation that someone is hiding in your closet or under your bed. Mia had always been a light sleeper, her senses heightened in the quiet of the night. Growing up in an old house with creaky floors and drafty windows, she had learned to tune out the usual creaks and groans of the house settling. But tonight was different. Tonight, an unsettling feeling crept over her, settling heavily in the pit of her stomach. She had just returned to her apartment after a long day at work, the weight of exhaustion pulling at her every step. She made a quick dinner, then curled up on her couch, the soft hum of the TV filling the room. But as the night deepened, Mia began to notice something she couldn't ignore, a feeling that something was wrong, something was off. It started as a vague unease, a sense that she wasn't alone. She tried to brush it off, blaming it on stress, but the feeling only grew stronger. Her gaze drifted toward her bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Her eyes lingered on the dimly lit room, the shadows playing tricks on her mind. No, it was nothing, she told herself. It was just the dark corners, her tired eyes playing tricks. But as she stood up to go to bed, the sensation followed her. The feeling of being watched, the prickling on the back of her neck, the sinking weight in her chest. She tried to shake it off, but her feet felt like lead as she walked toward her bedroom. She reached the door, but her eyes were drawn to something. The closet door, slightly cracked open. It was the small things, the subtle signs that triggered her growing anxiety. The way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the corners of the room, the air feeling colder than it should, the quiet hum of her own heartbeat. Her eyes locked onto the closet. She hadn't opened it earlier, and she was certain she had closed it when she left. But now, it stood ajar, just a sliver, as though something, or someone, was hiding inside. Her mind raced. She was alone in the apartment. Her phone was on the dresser, just within reach, but it felt like too much effort to take her eyes off the closet. What if someone was hiding in there? The thought came unbidden, but once it was there, it was impossible to ignore. Mia felt the chill spread through her limbs. She told herself it was nonsense. She had no reason to believe someone was hiding in her closet. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and her pulse quickened. She stepped forward, drawn to the closet door. As her fingers grazed the handle, she froze. There was something behind her, a whisper of movement, the faintest rustle of fabric, like someone shifting their weight beneath the bed. Mia's breath caught in her throat, and her body went rigid. Someone was under her bed. Her heart raced as panic clawed at her chest. She fought to stay calm, to think clearly, but the weight of fear pressed down on her. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes flicking toward the edge of the bed. She was sure of it now. There was something there. The bed was slightly raised, just enough for a person to hide, and the softest whisper of a breath reached her ears. She didn't dare move closer. Every instinct told her to run, to scream, to call for help, but her body remained frozen in place. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the bed. The silence in the room grew unbearable, broken only by the sound of her own shaky breaths. A shadow shifted. Mia's eyes snapped to the closet, her mind screaming at her to check it, to make sure there was no one hiding inside. But the whisper from beneath the bed stopped her cold. The sound wasn't the soft rustle of fabric. It was more deliberate, like someone was slowly, carefully, trying to get out without making a sound. Her heart hammered in her chest, every fiber of her being telling her to act, but her feet were rooted to the floor. And then it came, the softest creak of the floorboards, as if something had moved beneath her bed. It wasn't in her mind. Someone was there. The fear was paralyzing, and Mia's throat tightened. She couldn't scream. She couldn't move. Her mind was spinning, her body shaking, and all she could do was stare at the bed, hoping that somehow it was just a trick of her imagination. But deep down, she knew. Someone was hiding beneath her bed. The minutes felt like hours as she stood motionless in the doorway, her back pressed against the wall, too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to move. Every time she looked at the bed, the feeling of being watched only intensified. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The air grew thick with dread. And then, it happened. A hand, a pale, trembling hand, slowly emerging from beneath the bed, fingers brushing against the carpet. Mia's breath caught in her throat. It was real. Before she could react, the closet door slammed open with a loud crash. Her mind raced as she bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her legs burned with the effort of escaping the unseen terror that had invaded her space. She stumbled into the hallway, her hand gripping the doorknob as she fled into the safety of the apartment building's corridor. The door slammed shut behind her, and she stood there, gasping for breath, not daring to return. The sensation of being watched, the feeling of something lurking just out of sight, stayed with her even after she left her apartment that night. It followed her everywhere. No matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was always just behind her, waiting. And even now, as she sat in a cafe miles from her apartment, she couldn't shake the sensation that something was hiding beneath the table, waiting. Story 43. Finding strange footprints leading up to your front door, but no one's outside. It had been a long week for Sarah. Between work, errands, and the endless cycle of daily tasks, she was looking forward to a quiet weekend in her small cottage on the edge of town. The peace and solitude of her home were a welcome escape, especially after such a stressful few days. On Friday evening, Sarah arrived home just after dusk, the golden glow of the sunset casting long shadows across her front yard. She parked her car in the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires as she cut the engine. As she stepped out of the car, she paused, something catching her eye. Footprints. At first, she thought nothing of it. The ground was soft, a mix of damp earth and fallen leaves from the nearby trees. But as she looked closer, her stomach dropped. The footprints led directly up to her front door. They were fresh, deep and clear, as though someone had just walked up to her porch. What unsettled her wasn't the prints themselves, but the fact that there was no sign of anyone now. No person in sight, no car parked nearby, just emptiness. They were large, muddy footprints, their outlines crisp against the dirt. But as Sarah scanned the area around her, she saw no one. The night was quiet, too quiet. She looked up and down the street, her unease growing as she noticed that all the neighbors' houses seemed dark. No one was walking around, no one was nearby. The air felt heavy, and a cold breeze swept across her skin, sending a chill down her spine. She stepped closer to the footprints. They didn't look like the usual tracks she saw from local wildlife. or even neighbors' shoes. These were too deliberate, too heavy, and they led right to her door, stopping just short of the step. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood there, staring at the marks in the ground, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some prank, she thought. But the silence around her made it hard to ignore the strange feeling creeping up her spine. She slowly walked up to her door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The footprints were unmistakable. Someone had walked up to her house. But where were they now? Had they gone inside? Her mind raced with thoughts. She quickly checked around the door frame, wondering if the locks had been tampered with or if she had left it unlocked. But everything seemed fine. No signs of forced entry. The door was locked. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A strange sensation crawled under her skin, and she felt as though the night air had thickened, making it harder to breathe. Who could have left those footprints? Deciding she needed to make sure everything was okay, Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped back outside. She cautiously walked around the perimeter of her house, checking each window and corner, the beam of light flickering with her nervous movements. But everything was as it should be. Nothing was out of place, except for the footprints. After a few tense minutes, she returned to the front door, her mind still racing. She stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize the situation. She had never seen footprints like these before. So large, so purposeful, like someone was stalking the area around her home. Then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The footprints were no longer leading away from her house. The trail had turned around. It had circled back. Sarah's stomach churned as she realized the footprints were now leading away from the door, heading toward the edge of her yard and disappearing into the darkness of the trees. She hurried to the edge of her porch, shining the light into the shadows, hoping to spot whoever was out there. But there was nothing. The footprints stopped at the tree line, vanishing as if the person had melted into the night. No one was there. She stood frozen, the weight of the silence pressing on her ears. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. Sarah didn't dare go further into the woods. Instead, she backed slowly inside, bolting the door behind her, every instinct telling her to stay inside. The house felt like a safe cocoon, but even inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was just outside her walls, waiting. She tried to calm her nerves, but the unease remained. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The floorboards creaked as though something was moving just beyond her reach. The windows seemed to grow larger with every passing minute, their dark glass reflecting the shadows that pressed in closer. That night, Sarah barely slept, the sensation of being watched lingering like an oppressive weight. The next morning, she decided to investigate the trail one last time. Maybe it had been nothing more than an animal or a strange weather pattern. But when she stepped outside and walked over to the tree line, she found something that made her blood run cold. The footprints were gone. No sign of them. No trace of the muddy path that had once led up to her door. The earth was undisturbed, as though no one had ever walked there at all. Just smooth, untouched ground. Sarah stood there, staring at the empty space, her breath caught in her throat. She had seen the prints clearly. They had led to her door. Had she imagined it? Or had someone been there, watching her, waiting for her to discover them? All she knew for sure was that the sense of being followed, of something lurking in the shadows, had never left her. And as she stepped back inside her house, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, just beyond the trees, waiting to be found. Story 44. The feeling that the house is breathing, expanding, and contracting. It was a quiet, peaceful evening when Emma moved into her new home, a charming cottage tucked away on the outskirts of town. The house was old, its walls carrying the weight of generations, with creaky floorboards, wide windows, and a smell of aged wood that seemed to tell stories of its past. Emma had fallen in love with it the moment she stepped inside. It was perfect, just the escape she needed from her hectic life. The first few days in the cottage were blissful. She unpacked her boxes, arranged her bookshelves, and began to make the place feel like her own. But after a week, something started to change. It was subtle at first, so small that she didn't quite notice it, yet it gnawed at her. At night, as Emma lay in bed, she would hear the oddest sounds. The house seemed to groan, creak, and shift around her, as though it were alive. The sounds were nothing new. Old houses made noises, settling, creaking, shifting with time. But there was something about this house, something different. It wasn't just the usual noises. It felt alive. One night, as she lay in bed, she felt the room change. The air around her grew heavier, as though the very walls were expanding, filling with a strange, deep breath. She dismissed it as nothing more than the wind playing tricks on her. But the longer she lay there, the more intense the feeling became. The walls seemed to stretch outward, then contract, like the inhale and exhale of something large, something vast. Her chest tightened with the sensation. The house was breathing. Emma tried to ignore it. Maybe it was the old pipes, or the way the house settled into the earth. She convinced herself it was normal, that every house had its quirks. But over the next few nights, the sensation didn't fade. It grew stronger, more pronounced. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath her felt as though they were breathing with her, expanding and contracting in rhythm. When she stood near the door, she could almost feel the pulse of the house vibrating beneath her feet, as though the very foundation of the building was alive. And sometimes, it was not just the feeling of breathing, but the sound of it, a deep, guttural sigh from within the walls, as though the house were exhaling a tired, ancient breath. It was as if the house had a life of its own, a heartbeat that she could hear, feel, and almost taste in the air. One evening, while walking through the hallway, Emma noticed something strange. As she passed by the living room, she felt the temperature shift, a warm, suffocating wave washing over her. She stopped, confused, but the air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the very house itself was pressing in on her. She took a step back, and then the air seemed to draw back, as though the house was inhaling. That was when she knew. The house wasn't just settling. It was breathing, expanding and contracting like a living being. But why? The next morning, Emma couldn't shake the feeling. She walked around the house, her footsteps sounding unnervingly loud in the otherwise quiet space. As she explored each room, she began to notice something else. The walls in certain areas seemed slightly distorted, warped, like the house was gently swelling in some places and sinking in others. But the changes were so subtle, so gradual, that she doubted her own senses. In the kitchen, the cabinets felt warmer than usual. She ran her fingers across the counter, and it almost felt as though the wood beneath her hand was pulsing. She pulled her hand away, her heart racing, and instinctively looked around. But everything appeared to be as it should be. The kitchen was silent. But then, as the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, Emma felt it again. That deep, rhythmic breath. The house was expanding. She stepped into the living room, and the sensation intensified. It felt as though the room was stretching and folding, the walls gently giving way as though they were breathing in and out. The pulse was now unmistakable. With every breath, the house seemed to grow older, as if it were drawing strength from the very air around it. It felt as if it were absorbing something, some unseen energy, with each inhale, growing stronger, larger, and more alive with every passing moment. Emma rushed to the door, the pressure in the room making it hard to breathe. She had to get out. She needed to escape whatever was happening in this house. But as she reached for the door, it was as though the house itself closed in on her. The door wouldn't budge. It felt as though the house was holding her in place, the walls constricting around her like a vice. The pulse of the house grew more frantic, and with a force she couldn't explain, she managed to throw the door open. The air outside felt cool and refreshing, but as she stepped out onto the porch, she could still feel the presence of the house behind her, the rhythm of its breath echoing in her chest. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the house from a distance, its outline dark against the starry sky. The sense of life within it never stopped, the walls still expanding and contracting in the silent night. She could almost see the house breathing, its form shifting with every exhale. As she sat there, she began to realize that the house had a story, a deep, ancient story that had been buried for years, waiting for someone to listen. And now, it seemed, the house had chosen her. chosen her to feel its breath, to understand the pulse that had lived within its walls long before she had ever arrived. She couldn't explain it, but she knew one thing for certain. This house wasn't just a home. It was something more, something that lived. And with every breath it took, Emma wondered if she would ever be able to leave. Story 45. A broken window that wasn't broken before. Lena had always been a careful person. She prided herself on maintaining her home, making sure every task was done properly. The old house she had moved into just a few months ago was perfect for her. A quiet, secluded place surrounded by trees, offering peace and solitude after a busy day at work. There was just one thing that always bothered her: the large, old window in the living room. The window was beautiful, stained glass with intricate patterns that caught the sunlight perfectly, casting colorful shadows across the room. But it was old, and Lena often found herself wondering how much longer it would last before something happened to it. She had checked it repeatedly, making sure it was secure, and each time she left for work, she locked the door and double-checked the windows. One evening, Lena returned home after a late shift. The sky was dark, the house was quiet, and everything felt just as she had left it. She walked inside, dropping her bag by the door, and then paused. There was something off. A strange feeling hung in the air, like a cold draft moving through the house. But the heat was on, and the windows were all closed. Then she saw it. The window. The large stained glass window in the living room that had been perfectly intact that morning was now broken. Lena froze. She hadn't heard anything during the day. There hadn't been any storms or wind. She walked toward the window, her heartbeat increasing with every step. The glass was shattered, jagged pieces scattered across the floor, sparkling under the soft glow of the lamp. The air felt heavy as she stood before it, her mind racing with questions. How could this have happened? She was sure it had been fine when she left. No one had entered the house. She always locked the doors. But now the window was broken, and she hadn't heard a thing. Her hand instinctively reached for her phone, but as she glanced around the room, she felt an eerie stillness settle in. There were no signs of forced entry. The door was still locked. The other windows were intact. The only thing amiss was this one, solitary window that now lay in pieces at her feet. Lena bent down cautiously to inspect the shards of glass. They had fallen inward, not outward. It was as if something had pushed against the glass from the inside, causing it to shatter. But that didn't make sense. There was nothing inside the house that could have done that. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of a disturbance, any clue as to what had happened. But everything else appeared normal. The furniture was in place, the walls still adorned with her pictures, and the carpet was undisturbed. Yet, the broken window remained, mocking her with its silence. With a growing sense of unease, Lena stepped back and pulled the curtains shut. She needed to get a better look, see if there was something, anything, that could explain the strange incident. But as her hand reached for the curtain, she noticed something strange. The outside of the window, where the glass had broken, was spotless. There were no leaves or dirt, no evidence of something having struck the glass. The shards that had fallen were only inside the house. Her mind raced, trying to piece things together. Had someone broken in? Was this a warning? But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. She knew this house, every corner, every creak of the floor. She had been meticulous about security. So why was there no evidence of anyone entering? Lena stepped back into the living room, her breath shaky. The broken window seemed to have shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. The air felt colder, heavier, and the silence was overwhelming. It was as if the house itself had just exhaled, letting the stillness hang in the air. Then, she saw it. In the reflection of the broken window, she could see something moving behind her. The shadows cast by the soft lighting in the room seemed to stretch, almost as if they were alive, moving toward her. Lena turned quickly, but the room was empty. No one was there. Her heart raced, and her mind spun. She could still feel the strange, shifting air around her, like the room was alive, watching her. She backed toward the door, her hand gripping the doorknob tightly. But just before she left, she glanced at the window one last time. The broken glass, which had been scattered across the floor moments before, was no longer there. It had all disappeared. The window was still shattered, but the shards were now gone, as if they had melted into the air, leaving no trace behind. Lena stood frozen in disbelief, staring at the now pristine window frame. No glass on the floor, no shards in sight, just an empty space, as if the window had been broken. But somehow it wasn't real anymore. Her pulse quickened, and without another thought, she rushed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew she couldn't stay there another moment. For weeks after that night, Lena couldn't explain the broken window, nor the strange, inexplicable feeling that had followed. Every time she stepped into her living room, she half expected the window to be shattered again, but it remained whole, as though it had never been broken. And yet, each time she glanced at it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. Something was watching her through that very window. Story 46. The eerie stillness of your house, where everything feels unnaturally quiet. Sophie had always loved quiet places. Growing up in a bustling city, the constant hum of traffic and chatter was something she had always wished to escape. So, when she found the small, cottage-style house on the outskirts of town, she knew it was exactly what she needed: peace, solitude, and a refuge from the chaos of her daily life. The first few days in her new home were blissful. The house, though old and a little weathered, had a charm to it. The creaking floors, the faint smell of wood and dust, and the way the light filtered through the curtains made it feel like something out of a storybook. She felt a sense of comfort in the silence, the stillness that filled the air. No honking cars, no bustling neighbors, just the gentle sounds of nature surrounding her. But over time, Sophie began to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, a quietness that seemed to linger in the corners of the rooms. At night, when the world outside was silent, she would lie in bed, feeling an almost oppressive stillness settling in the house. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence. No, this was something different. The silence was so absolute, so complete, that it almost felt like the house was holding its breath. The ticking of her kitchen clock, which had always been a comforting background noise, was strangely absent. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, none of it was there. It was as if every sound had been swallowed up by the thick, heavy air. Sophie would sit in her living room, her eyes scanning the empty space, listening intently, but there was only an unsettling quiet that seemed to grow louder in her ears. She tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just the house settling, or perhaps the isolation was playing tricks on her. But the more she stayed in the house, the more she began to feel as though the silence was something alive, something that knew she was there, watching her every move. One evening, as Sophie was reading on the couch, she felt the weight of the silence press against her. The air was dense, and the house felt too still. She glanced around, her heart beginning to race. It wasn't the normal quiet she had grown to love. It was unnatural, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She stood up and walked toward the hallway, hoping the small movement would break the oppressive stillness. As she passed by the kitchen, she froze. The room was darker than usual, the shadows deep and unnerving. Nothing made a sound. She reached for the light switch, but as her hand hovered near it, she felt a strange sensation, like something unseen was watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she quickly flicked the switch, flooding the room with light. The sound of the light bulb buzzing was a relief, a small noise breaking through the quiet. But even then, the silence still lingered. It didn't go away. Sophie shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. She made her way back to the living room, where she sat down on the couch again. The quiet seemed to envelop her, growing heavier, denser. Then came the strange occurrences. The first one was small, a door, which Sophie was sure she had closed, now slightly ajar. She had always been meticulous about closing the doors behind her, but now this one was open, just a crack. She didn't remember leaving it like that. She stood there for a moment, staring at it, but then she shrugged it off, thinking she must have forgotten. The next day, it happened again. The kitchen drawer, where she kept her silverware, was open just enough to notice. Sophie swore she had closed it the night before, but now it was halfway pulled out. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise once more, but again, she dismissed it. It was just her imagination. But as the days passed, the feeling of the house being too still, too quiet, continued. The air in the rooms became thicker, as if it was more difficult to breathe. Sophie couldn't pinpoint when it started, but she realized that the house was no longer just quiet. It was completely devoid of any normal noise. There were no creaks from the floorboards, no wind outside brushing against the windows, not even the faintest hum of an appliance. It was like the world had been swallowed whole. One evening, Sophie couldn't stand it any longer. She decided to take a walk outside, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. But as she opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the strangest thing happened. The house felt like it was holding her back. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, and the stillness pressed against her chest. She had never felt so suffocated, so alone in her life. She stepped back inside, her mind racing, and the moment the door shut behind her, she was hit with an overwhelming sense that she wasn't alone. The silence had changed. Now, it was filled with a low, barely perceptible hum. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, pulsating in rhythm with her heartbeat. She stood still in the middle of the living room, waiting, listening, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, the humming grew louder, like an echo inside her head. Then she heard it, a soft, slow creak from above. She glanced upward, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. The sound was coming from the ceiling. It was a subtle sound, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was up there. Heart racing, Sophie took a step back, glancing around. The stillness of the house felt like it was closing in on her, the walls tightening, the air growing heavier with every passing second. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The house was no longer just quiet. It was waiting. Story 47. Your phone ringing with a private number, and no one answers when you pick up. Megan had always been cautious about her privacy. She was meticulous about who had her number and rarely answered calls from unknown or private numbers. But tonight was different. She had just returned from a long day at work, her mind still spinning with the stress of meetings and deadlines. She was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. Just her, a warm cup of tea, and maybe a book or some music. But as she sat down on the couch, her phone rang. It was an unusual ring, one she had set for unknown callers, so her first instinct was to ignore it. But as the screen lit up, she saw it was a private number. Megan hesitated, her thumb hovering over the reject button. She didn't recognize the number, but it was a slow evening, and her curiosity got the better of her. Maybe it was something important, she thought. She swiped the screen to pick up. "Hello?" she said, her voice tentative, unsure who she was addressing. There was nothing but silence on the other end. She frowned and held the phone closer to her ear. "Hello?" she repeated, now feeling a bit uneasy. Still, nothing. No breathing, no clicking sounds, just an eerie, complete silence. She waited, trying to make sense of it, but all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. The quiet was deafening, like the world around her had come to a standstill. She even checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. The timer was still ticking. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, more forcefully this time. "Who is this? Is there anyone there?" But still, no response. No sound, just the unsettling silence. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Her instinct screamed at her to hang up, but something held her there. The phone felt too heavy in her hand, as if it was anchoring her to the moment. Just when she thought she couldn't take the silence any longer, the voice came. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it sent a chill through her bones. "I see you." Megan's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, but her body was frozen. The voice wasn't familiar. It was low, breathy, almost as if it was coming from a great distance. Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the screen, her fingers trembling as she lowered the phone. The call had ended, but the unsettling words echoed in her mind. "I see you." She felt a sudden urge to look around, as if someone, something, was watching her. But when she did, there was no one in the room. The silence that had seemed so calming just moments before now felt suffocating. She stood up, pacing nervously, trying to shake the feeling that had settled deep in her stomach. Her phone buzzed again, making her jump. She quickly glanced at the screen, expecting another private call, but this time it was a text message. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it was from a number she didn't recognize. "I'm still watching." Her blood ran cold. Megan's hand shook as she read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. She frantically checked the list of contacts in her phone, but the number wasn't listed. The message seemed to come from nowhere. Panic began to rise in her chest. Was this a prank? Or was someone out there really watching her? Her mind raced back to the call, the voice. It was too real, too personal, like whoever was on the other side knew exactly where she was, what she was doing. She had checked all the locks, all the windows. She lived alone, and she'd heard nothing, seen nothing that could explain the creeping fear settling over her. She decided to take action. Grabbing her keys, she made her way to the front door, checking the locks one more time. But as she reached for the doorknob, her phone buzzed again. "Turn around." Megan froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the words sank in. She slowly turned her head toward the living room, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The room was still, just as she had left it, but a strange, foreboding feeling had settled in her gut. Then, she saw it. On the kitchen counter, her phone was vibrating again. But this time, it wasn't a text. It was a photo. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the screen. The photo was blurry, taken in a hurry, but it was unmistakable. It was a picture of her, sitting on the couch, holding the phone just moments before. The image sent a jolt of fear straight to her core. Someone had been inside her house. There was no other explanation. She hadn't heard anyone come in, but the photo was clear. The door was locked, the windows were shut. How could this be? She quickly backed away from the kitchen counter, trying to make sense of it all. Her breathing grew shallow as she looked around the room, the shadows growing long as the sun sank beneath the horizon. Then, she heard the sound she had been dreading, the faint, distant sound of her phone ringing once again. The screen lit up with a private number, but this time, she didn't pick up. Story 48. An uninvited visitor knocking at the door, but there's no one there when you check. It was a quiet evening at Claire's apartment, the kind of evening where everything was calm, the city noises were faint, and the soft hum of her air conditioner was the only background sound. She had settled into her favorite chair, curled up with a book, trying to escape into another world after a long, grueling week at work. The apartment was small, but cozy. She had moved in just a few months ago, and while the place still felt unfamiliar at times, it was beginning to feel like home. The sounds of her neighbors coming and going were the usual noises she had come to expect. But tonight, there was something different. As Claire flipped through the pages, a sudden knock echoed from the door. It wasn't the usual thump of someone knocking too hard. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone unsure if they should even be there. At first, Claire thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, so she paused, listening intently. The apartment was silent again, save for the quiet rustle of her pages turning. But then came the knock again. Tap, tap, tap. She froze. It was unmistakable. Someone was at her door. Curious and a little confused, Claire got up, her feet shuffling across the hardwood floor. Who could it be? It was late, too late for visitors, and she certainly wasn't expecting anyone. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing. The hall outside was empty. No one in sight. Confused and slightly uneasy, Claire opened the door slowly, half expecting to find someone standing there with an apology or an excuse. But when she swung it open, there was nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway stretching off into the distance. No one was there. She glanced up and down the corridor, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement, but it was eerily still. No one was in sight. No one lurking around a corner. Just silence. Claire's heart began to race. Had she imagined the knock? It had sounded so real, but standing in the doorway, she couldn't explain it. She quickly closed the door, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. She stood still for a moment, the weight of the silence pressing in on her, but then she shrugged it off. Maybe it was someone at the wrong apartment, perhaps a mistake. But no sooner had she turned around than there was another knock. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Claire felt a rush of cold air as her breath hitched in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't. The knock came from right behind the door, and the sound was so close. It felt as though someone was standing there, just waiting for her to open up again. Her pulse quickened, and she hesitated. Should she open the door again? Was it a prank? Or worse, was it something else? With her heart pounding in her ears, she slowly inched the door open again, her hands trembling as she did. She peered through the peephole once more, but this time she saw nothing. Still no one. She swung the door open wide, her eyes scanning the empty hallway. There was only a faint draft of air, but no sign of anyone standing there. Nothing but the quiet, dim-lit corridor. Confused and growing more anxious by the second, Claire stepped back inside, closing the door with a little more force than necessary. She leaned against the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. But just as she tried to calm herself, another sound, a soft, scraping noise, came from the door frame itself. Her eyes widened. She walked over to the door, staring at the spot where the frame met the wall. There was a long, deep mark, almost as if something had scratched at it. Her mind raced. Was someone playing a trick on her? But it didn't feel like a prank. There was an oppressive feeling in the air, something she couldn't quite explain. Still shaken, Claire decided to check the building. Maybe the hallway had been too dimly lit before, or maybe someone had been walking by without her noticing. She grabbed her keys, locked her door behind her, and stepped into the hallway. She walked to the end of the hall, peeking into the stairwell and checking the elevator area. The hall was empty. Not a single person was in sight. She walked the full length of the corridor, then back again, glancing into the shadows at the edges of the hall, checking behind every corner. But there was no one. No footsteps, no movement, no sign of anything unusual. And yet, the feeling lingered. That strange unease that she couldn't shake. As she returned to her apartment, her hand reached for the door handle, but before she touched it, a sudden realization hit her. The scratching sound, it wasn't just on the doorframe anymore. It was coming from inside her apartment. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind raced. There was no one there. She had checked the entire building, but now, that sound, the scraping, clawing noise, was unmistakably coming from inside her apartment. Story 49. The feeling of someone gently tugging on your blanket while you sleep. It had been a long, exhausting day for Sarah. She had just moved into her new apartment, a quaint, older building that had its quirks. The creaky floors and the occasional strange noises from the walls didn't bother her much. She'd always been a bit of a skeptic, dismissing oddities as mere imagination. Tonight, however, she had a feeling she couldn't shake. She had just finished unpacking the last of her things and decided to rest. The bedroom was cozy, with soft lighting and a comfortable bed that looked too inviting to resist. She had always been a fan of heavy blankets, the kind that made her feel secure and warm, especially during the chill of autumn nights. After a long, hot shower, Sarah crawled into bed, pulling the thick, quilted blanket up to her chin, cocooning herself in warmth. She closed her eyes and let out a deep sigh, her body sinking into the mattress. The quiet hum of the city outside was the only sound that accompanied her as she drifted off to sleep. But something was wrong. Sarah didn't know how long she had been asleep when she felt it, a slight, almost imperceptible tug on her blanket. At first, she dismissed it. Maybe it was just the weight of the blanket shifting, or perhaps it was the air conditioning causing the fabric to move. But then it happened again, a gentle pull at the corner of the blanket, just enough to make it feel as if someone was slowly tugging it from her. Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she tried to make sense of the sensation. It wasn't strong, but it was persistent. Someone was gently pulling on her blanket, as if trying to take it from her, but without the urgency of a violent tug. Her heartbeat quickened. She couldn't be imagining this, could she? She lay still, trying to figure out what was happening. The pull didn't stop. It was subtle but real, as if someone was carefully, deliberately tugging the blanket down from her body, inch by inch. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Her breath became shallow, and she turned her head, half expecting to see someone standing at the foot of her bed. But there was no one. The room was dark and still, except for the faint moonlight streaming through the curtains. Still, the tugging continued, almost rhythmic now, like a quiet whisper in the night. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, but the pressure grew stronger, as if an invisible force was trying to pull it away from her, coaxing it inch by inch down her body. Sarah sat up, panic rising in her chest. This isn't real. She told herself, it's just exhaustion, just a dream. But she could feel it. There was something there. Something pulling, something unseen, but very real. She flicked the light on, the harsh brightness flooding the room. The tugging stopped instantly. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for what had just happened. But the room was as she had left it, empty, still, and quiet. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It had to be some kind of weird trick her mind was playing on her, she reasoned. Maybe it was the stress from the move. Maybe she was just overtired. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She glanced at the corner of the bed where the blanket had been pulled. The fabric now lay neatly in place, just the way she had arranged it when she first climbed in. But as she settled back into bed, ready to try and calm her nerves, a new sensation crept over her. The blanket felt heavier, a slight weight that hadn't been there before. She pulled it up, cocooning herself once more, but the sensation of being watched lingered. She lay still, her eyes darting to the door, to the dark corners of the room, searching for an explanation. But nothing, just silence. Seconds later, the tugging returned. This time, it was more pronounced, strong enough to pull her arm out from under the blanket. Her heart skipped a beat. It was no longer just a light tug. It was as if something was trying to drag her. She bolted upright, the blanket slipping off her body. Something was definitely there. Her pulse raced as her hands scrambled to push the blanket back into place, to hold onto something, anything. But it wouldn't stop. The tugging didn't stop. The invisible force on the blanket, like a child playing a quiet game in the dark, continued pulling at it, this time harder. Suddenly, the air felt cold. The room had grown unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that sank deep into your bones, freezing you in place. She leapt out of bed, her legs shaky as she scrambled to the door. She wasn't staying here another second. As she reached for the doorknob, the tugging stopped once again, as if whatever had been there had decided to let go. But even though the pulling had stopped, Sarah couldn't shake the cold weight of the room, the strange, suffocating air, the lingering sensation that something unseen had been there with her, something that had been quietly watching and waiting. She rushed out of the room, shutting the door behind her, but the feeling of the tugging didn't fade. It stayed with her, lingering in the back of her mind, like a whisper she couldn't forget. Story 50. An unsettling noise in the house every time you try to fall asleep alone. Every night, without fail, Emma heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, an eerie, rhythmic noise that echoed through her house, just when she was on the brink of falling asleep. The first time it happened, she thought it was nothing more than the house settling, the creaks of old wood stretching under the pressure of a quiet night. But as the nights passed, the noise persisted. It was always the same, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping that seemed to come from the walls, or perhaps from somewhere deep within the house itself. It started gently, like the distant sound of fingernails tapping against wood, a small, repetitive sound that made the hair on the back of Emma's neck stand on end. She would lie still in her bed, listening intently, wondering if she was just imagining it. But no, there it was again, a quiet, rhythmic tap, 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 tap. At first, she tried to brush it off. It could have been the plumbing, or perhaps a neighbor's late-night activities filtering through the walls. But each night, it grew harder to ignore. The tapping would begin right when she tried to close her eyes, just as she was about to drift into sleep, the noise breaking the quiet of the room like an unwelcome guest. The sound always came from the same spot, beneath the floorboards, she thought, or maybe from the wall just behind her bed. She couldn't tell, but it was always right there, on the edge of her consciousness, waiting for her to try and sleep. One night, Emma decided she wouldn't let the noise keep her awake. She had to face it. She got out of bed, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and began to walk through the house. The living room, the kitchen, and the hallway all seemed as they should, empty and quiet. Nothing out of place. She returned to her room and stood still, listening. And there it was again, the tapping. This time, it seemed closer, as though it had moved from the walls to the floor beneath her. It came in soft, measured intervals, like someone trying to get her attention. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was now so loud that it almost drowned out the stillness of the night. Her heart thudded in her chest. She knelt down beside the bed, peering at the floorboards, hoping to find some explanation. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the house and the sound of her breath. She checked the window, ensuring it was locked. The noise persisted, but Emma wasn't one to back down from her fears. The noise had been going on for too long, and she needed to understand it. With resolve in her chest, she pulled up the rug beneath her bed and bent down, prying open the floorboards. The tapping sound stopped instantly, and she froze, her pulse racing. She stared down into the small gap between the floorboards and the subfloor. Nothing. There was nothing there. No mouse. No loose pipe. No reason for the noise at all. Feeling unnerved but determined, she sat back on her bed. Perhaps it had stopped, but just as she lay down, it started again. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, more urgent. It was as if the sound was right beneath her, as if something, or someone, was waiting for her to listen. Emma pulled the blanket tightly around her and squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ignore it, trying to block it out. She was tired. She just wanted to sleep. But the tapping wouldn't stop. It grew faster now, like fingers drumming, insistent and impatient. She bolted upright, her heart hammering. The noise had moved. It was coming from above her now. Her eyes shot to the ceiling, wide with dread. The tapping was now rhythmic, as though someone, was walking just above her, tapping along the ceiling with every step. Her room was on the second floor. There was no one above her. No attic. No neighbors. Just an empty space. But the tapping didn't stop. Tap, 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 tap. It was moving again. The noise shifted toward the corner of the room, near the closet. Her legs felt like lead as she stood and walked toward the closet, her hands shaking. She opened it, her breath shallow, scanning every corner. The closet was empty. There was nothing but clothes and a few scattered shoes. But then, a soft rustling noise emerged from the very corner of the closet, and her eyes shot to the spot. The tapping stopped. She took a step back, her pulse quickening. She turned around, scanning the room, expecting to find something, someone, but the room was empty. And then, the silence. The room felt too still, too quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. Emma couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. She backed toward her bed, her eyes darting toward the window, and suddenly, she noticed something strange. The shadows on the floor seemed to move, not in the way they should from the dim moonlight outside, but as though something was casting its own dark shape onto the ground. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. The tapping had stopped, but something else had taken its place. An oppressive presence that filled the room, making it hard to breathe. She quickly closed her eyes and covered her ears, hoping it would go away. But the silence held. The next morning, when she tried to tell her friends about the noise, they laughed it off. Maybe it was the wind, they suggested. Maybe it was the house settling. But Emma knew what she had felt, what she had heard. The tapping never stopped. Not entirely. Every night, just as she was about to fall asleep, it would begin again, softly at first, and then more insistently. A quiet reminder that some things in the house should never be questioned. Now that you've heard these stories, ask yourself, what would you do if it happened to you? The next time you're home alone, are you sure you'll be safe? Are you absolutely certain there's nothing lurking in the dark, waiting to make its move? Remember, the scariest thing about being alone is never knowing what's watching you. So, next time the lights flicker or the wind howls outside, you might want to think twice before looking around the corner. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you've ever experienced something strange at home alone, tell us about it in the comments. Stay safe, stay alert, and always trust your instincts.